So I said I would post some background information for the campaign, and I started reading through all of the information. And the problem with all of the pertinent information that's out there is that for the most part it tends to be scattered all over different resources. So there's a little bit in one book, a little bit in another book. A lot of it comes from the campaign book itself, but it's kind of all over the place. And so I started getting it all together to just kind of copy and paste it, but it looked like it was going to turn into a big mess that nobody really wanted to read through. So instead, I decided to make a video that's going to take everybody through most of the basic information that we need to start the campaign. So without giving away any spoilers, I think it's important for this campaign that the players know something about the city that we are going to be spending the time in. The campaign is taking place almost entirely in or around the city of Kintargo. And so it's important that the players become familiar with that city over the course of the campaign, but I think it's also important that everybody knows something about it to begin with. And in order to know something about the city, you have to know something about the country that it's in. And it just so happens that the country that Kintargo in, Cheliax, is actually kind of a pivotal region as far as the history of the world as we know it goes. And so to really understand kind of what's going on, we kind of have to start pretty much at the beginning. So we'll start off with just some basic information about the world of Pathfinder. And that world is called Golarion. Golarion is actually the name of the planet where pretty much everything within the Pathfinder universe takes place. Pathfinder doesn't necessarily focus on the entire planet. For the most part, the game is focused on what's called the Inner Sea region, which is what's on the screen at the moment. The Inner Sea region is where pretty much all of the adventures in Pathfinder take place. And of course, individual GMs may create stories outside of the region, and there's a whole rest of the planet for doing that. And then there is information available about that, but most of it is focused right here on this region. The Inner Sea region is comprised of basically two continents. The northern continent is called Avestan, and the second is Garund. Avestan is kind of like Europe, essentially. It's kind of like the Western civilization, home to many different countries and civilizations over a long period of time. Many empires and civilizations have risen and fallen, and it's a very well-populated, very well-civilized place. Pretty much every race on the planet has some sort of, if not stronghold, then strong presence somewhere in Avestan. This is actually the continent where we are going to be spending our adventures. The other continent, Garund, it's got its own civilizations, but this continent has much more history to it than it does like current day happenings. There are people living there now. There are some civilizations, especially like on the northern coasts, but for the most part, the continent is full of ancient ruins that have fallen basically into complete obscurity. And so a lot of it to the current day is essentially unexplored. And so a lot of times, if there's an adventure path where the players are going out exploring new territory, lost ancient ruins, trying to discover ancient technologies or magics, this is where it's going to be set. There's a lot of mystical stuff there, a lot of unknown things. In between the two continents is what's called the Inner Sea, and that is where the region gets its name from. It is the large sea that separates the two continents. So now that we've talked about the geography of the overall region a little bit, let's go into some of the history of this region. And this is where we're going way back. So to start off with, I should point out that the current year is 4719 AR, which stands for Absalom Reckoning. And we'll talk about what that means in a little bit. But to start off with, we are going back just about 10,000 years to the Aslanti civilization. Now, this was a civilization of humans that was much more advanced and much more powerful than any other civilization on the planet at the time. And in fact was probably more advanced than any current day civilization. And of course, like any advanced ancient civilization, they ended up being destroyed. That tends to be a common theme in any sort of story like that. So the Aslanti civilization was destroyed in the year negative 5293 AR, which is about 10,000 years ago. And it was destroyed in an event called Earthfall. Earthfall, there's a whole lot that goes along with Earthfall and the destruction of the civilization and why it happened. But just to go over really quickly, it was basically a race of Cthulhu-type beings who decided, no, this civilization needs to die. In fact, let's destroy the whole planet by crashing a giant magical meteor into the planet. Long story short, they didn't manage to destroy the whole planet, but they did manage to destroy the Aslanti civilization as well as much of the population of Golarion at the time. There were very few Aslanti survivors, and over the next 1,000 years or so, the entire planet was literally plunged into darkness because of just the destruction of this meteor crashing into it. And so it made it very difficult for people to survive. In addition to that darkness, the whole planet basically changed at that point. The continent that the Aslanti civilization was on was pretty much completely obliterated, and now there's almost nothing left of it. And that's way off to the west of the map as we see it. But the major significant thing that did for our map was that one of the larger chunks of that meteor fell right where the inner sea is now, and that is what created the inner sea. So that's how that got to be there. So when the Aslanti civilization was destroyed, like I said, there were a few survivors, and there was one man who stepped up and led the survivors out of the ruined continent, and most of them came over to Aveston and kind of the inner sea region. And he led them over there, and his name was Aridin. Aridin had been a prominent and powerful person in the Aslanti civilization to begin with, and so when he led the survivors over, he continued to be a very powerful and prominent person. And over many, many, many years, in fact, approximately 5,000 years or so, he actually continued to live. I suppose the Aslanti were a little more long-lived than normal humans. Meanwhile, the rest of the Aslanti survivors, they slowly died off over the years. They intermarried and had families with the lesser human races, and so the Aslanti civilization essentially disappeared, and eventually Aridin was the only one left. And so we can skip approximately 5,000 years of history. Aridin does a lot of stuff in that time, defeats all sorts of bad guys, and does all sorts of good stuff, and he's an all-around great guy. But about 5,000 years later, at the year 1 AR, Aridin goes to the site of where that large chunk of meteor crashed and created the inner sea. That chunk of meteor being known as the Starstone. And he, using all sorts of very powerful magics, raised it from the bottom of the inner sea and raised this island in the middle of the sea around it. And then he created sort of this labyrinthian citadel around the Starstone on the top of this hill on the island. And so he protected the Starstone in that way. And he did that to make sure that it stayed protected. And nobody could use it as a weapon like it had been used before or anything like that. And when he did this, the gods, I guess, kind of liked what he did, because they raised him up to godhood himself. And he essentially left the mortal plane at that point and became a god. And he took on the responsibilities basically as the god of humanity, as well as history, innovation, and culture. And so humans especially really revered Eredin as their patron god. Surrounding this citadel is a city named Absalom, and this is where we get the Absalom reckoning from, in the date, the AR. And this is basically the largest city in the world at this point. It immediately sprang up on this island after Eredin raised it, and is now its own powerful city-state. It doesn't command a country of its own necessarily, it just basically has the island, and it's happy with that, but it is the largest, most cosmopolitan city in the world. So now that we know who Eredin is and how he became a god and raised the Starstone and all that, we can move in and take a closer look at the country of Cheliax, where we're going to be having our campaign. And we're going to talk about how it came to be where it is now. Cheliax started off, of course, there's a lot of history to its beginnings. It was originally part of the Taldan Empire, and it broke off, but we don't need to talk about that in detail. Suffice it to say that it broke off of the Taldan Empire and became its own country in 4079 AR. So a little bit less than 700 years ago from the present day. And Cheliax immediately became a major power in the region, in large part because of an ancient Aslanti prophecy about Cheliax, saying that Eredin, the god of humanity, would return to Golarion in the year 4606, somewhere in Cheliax. And so Cheliax had kind of this divine mandate that it was able to claim this importance. And so over the years, Cheliax was very heavily into worship of Eredin. They took it very seriously. And Eredin worship basically centered out of Cheliax. And of course it was a worldwide religion, but that made Cheliax very powerful. It was also very powerful militarily, and it controlled a lot of territory and all that. And so a lot of stuff happened over that period of time, the almost 700 years between then and now. The one thing we need to talk about that's going to be important for the campaign is the foundation of the Hell Knight orders. The Hell Knights were started by a man named Didion Rule in 4575 AR, so about 150 years before present day. Didion Rule was a very strong follower of Eredin, whose family was murdered by a cult of devil worshippers in the city of West Crown, which at the time was the capital of Cheliax. And so he went to the government and tried to get them to root out this cult and get rid of it, and so he could find justice for his murdered family. And it turned out that the cult itself had infiltrated the government, and so there were these insiders there that basically blocked everything he tried to do, and so the government was no help to him. And the whole process left him very disillusioned, and he ended up renouncing Eredin completely, and he founded his own order of knights to go after this cult. And at the time, because of his renouncement of Eredin in a country where Eredin was followed very strictly, the Order of Knights was nicknamed the Hell Knights. So with this Order of Knights, he went out and he managed to completely wipe out this cult. And from there, the Hell Knights just continued to grow, now with the purpose of maintaining law. And so the Hell Knights are an order of knights that are very committed to lawfulness. They're really not concerned so much with morality, though. It doesn't matter to the Hell Knights if you're good, neutral, or evil, as long as you're lawful. You need to follow the law. And so the Hell Knights ended up kind of growing up into the elite police force of Cheliax. Even before Cheliax turned into the evil civilization that we know it as today. And they didn't start off as evil. And in fact, to this day, they are not necessarily evil, although there are plenty of evil members. So over the 150 years of their existence, the Hell Knights have split into different orders, such as the Order of the Rack, Order of the God Claw, Order of the Scourge. There are many orders. Every one operates a little bit differently. Every one kind of focuses on a different aspect of keeping the law. Like some will go out and like they are looking specifically for seditious elements in society and rebels. Some are out hunting like witches, stuff like that. And the Hell Knights are going to play a significant part in the story that we have to tell. So that finally brings us to the culmination of the Starfall Doctrine, which, like I said, was supposed to take place in the year 4606. And so that year came around, and all the priests and everybody in the country, and everybody outside the country essentially, was ready for Eredin to return. Everybody was waiting for it. And then on the day that it was supposed to happen, instead of a god returning, suddenly there was basically a worldwide system of giant storms that lasted for 3 weeks. And when they finally subsided, the priests of Eredin found themselves cut off from him entirely, and there was no sign of him to be found. And it became apparent that Eredin, instead of returning, had died. And nobody could explain this. And to this day, nobody really knows what happened. It's a complete mystery, even to the gods themselves. So this affected the religious atmosphere of pretty much the entire continent of Avestan, if not beyond. But especially Cheliax, where most of their society was built on Eredin and his return. And so Cheliax almost immediately just fell into chaos. The king completely just lost control. The different noble families split off and started fighting amongst themselves, and the whole country fell into civil war. And this civil war went on to last for more than 30 years. And during that time, there was constant fighting. There were plagues, there were famines, everything that goes along with war, and it was just a terrible place to be. Until finally, a noblewoman by the name of Abigail Thrune made a pact with the powers of hell and joined forces with them. And with the assistance of these bound devils, she quickly managed to subdue all of the other factions vying for control of the country. And within a year had completely subdued all of them. And so in the year 4640 AR, she was crowned as her infernal magistrix, Abigail Thrune. And one of the first things that she did once she was in power was that she established diabolism as the state religion. So now it is required that everybody in the country worships these devils. And especially Asmodeus, the king of the devils, the equivalent to Satan in the theology of Pathfinder. And then almost immediately afterwards, she moved the capital of Cheliax from West Crown, where it had always been, to the city of Egorian. And so that is where the capital is now, and that's where she rules from. And so there are now two major powers in the country, and that is the Thrunes themselves and the Church of Asmodeus. And the two work together to keep the country in line. Meanwhile, not everybody in the country really likes the fact that they are being ruled by a bunch of Diabolists and the Church of Asmodeus. But in general, people put up with it because of how bad it was in the Civil War. They generally think it's better to have this demon-controlled peace than to be plunged back into war for another 30 years or so. And so the Thrunes maintain control over the people, even if it's begrudging control. And so Cheliax has been ruled by House Thrune for about the past 79 years. Abigail Thrune was eventually assassinated by her own son, who took power, but he only lasted another couple years or so before he also died under mysterious circumstances. And there was a whole line of new family members coming up and then quickly dying off. But now for the past decade, the country has been under the rule of Abigail's great-granddaughter, Abigail Thrune II, and she continues to reign to this day. So now that we've gone over some of the history of Cheliax and of the world itself, we can start taking a closer look at the region where the campaign is going to be taking place. And so we're going to zoom in a little bit on the Archduchy of Ravounel. And this is the northernmost part of the country of Cheliax. This is where the city of Kintargo is located. Geographically speaking, the most prominent feature is Ravounel Forest, which is where the Archduchy gets its name. Ravounel Forest has sort of a dangerous reputation among the inhabitants of Cheliax, and this is mostly because of a tribe of Strix that takes residence in the forest. And Strix are a race of avian humanoids that historically do not get along well with humans, and they tend to be rather hostile. And so people tend to stay away from the Ravounel Forest. Other than that, there are two rivers that join together. The larger one is the Ulubilis River, and the other one is the Catharavusa River that joins the Ulubilis about halfway through, and then the two of them flow together into Nisroch Bay. And that, at the mouth of the Ulubilis River, is where the city of Kintargo is located. The city of Kintargo is the second largest city in the Archduchy of Ravounel. The larger city, Vyre, is located on Vyre Island in Nisroch Bay. And Vyre is kind of special because it has actually maintained a very high degree of autonomy. For the most part, it's able to run itself without too much government interference. And probably the reason for this is because the whole city is set up on the idea of anonymity and secrecy. It's basically the Las Vegas of the Pathfinder world. What happens in Vyre stays in Vyre. And because of that, it's kind of a favorite place for people from Cheliax, especially the nobles and those in power, where they can go and just spend their vacation doing pastimes that might be questionable elsewhere. And in Vyre, it's perfectly okay. But perhaps the most important geographical feature, at least politically, are the Menador Mountains. And these are mountains that stretch all along the southern border of the Archduchy of Ravounel and basically cut the entire Archduchy off from the rest of Cheliax. There is a single pass, the Menador Pass, that leads through the mountains. Other than that, it's steep rock climbing pretty much everywhere you want to go. And so it's really not easy to get, at least by land, to Ravounel, to Kintargo, or even to Vyre. And because of this, the entire Archduchy of Ravounel, notably Vyre and Kintargo, have been allowed much more flexibility in how they want to run themselves. The government doesn't get in their affairs as much because it's difficult to. It's hard to run the city that you're cut off from. And so while the government still does have a hold on these cities, they have a bit more freedom than other cities in the country. And so that finally brings us to the city of Kintargo itself. And here we see the city on a nice overcast day with the sun setting over Nizhrock Bay. There are 3 structures that dominate the skyline of the city, as you can see. The 2 in the foreground, the one on the left, that is Castle Kintargo. The one on the right is the Temple of Asmodeus up on top of the Temple Hill. And then off in the background, the tallest of the 3 structures is the Alabaster Academy. Now, as I said, the city of Kintargo is located in the mouth of the Ulubalis River, and the larger and older part of the city is on an island in the mouth of the river called Argo Isle. And then on the north bank of the river is the rest of the city. And the 2 parts of the city are connected by a single bridge known as Bleak Bridge. And that bridge is actually, it's a pretty large bridge, and it's got a market on the bridge, and it acts as sort of the main market for the city, although there are a number of other markets scattered throughout. There are 2 characteristics about the city that people tend to notice when they first see it. The first is that many of the buildings in the city, especially the larger ones, were built out of the local limestone, which is flecked with silver. And so the whole city just seems to have this shiny quality to it. And then, because of the farmland upriver, there's a lot of silt and sediment in the river, which during sunrise and sunset, when the sun hits the water at a certain angle, causes the water itself to shimmer a silvery, shiny color. And so the city has been nicknamed the Silver City. And a lot of times people will call it the Silver City of Kintargo. In addition to giving the city its nickname, silver is also one of the main exports of Kintargo because there is a lot of silver in the foothills of the Menador Mountains. In addition to that, the 2 other largest exports of the city are seafood, which there's an abundance of fish in the river and in the bay, and salt, which the city itself uses to preserve its catch of fish and then to export what it doesn't use, which turns out to be quite profitable. And so the city is fairly self-sustaining, and its trade is thriving, and it has always done pretty well. Culturally, the city has always been seen as a haven for artists, especially composers, directors, and musicians. There's a very strong artistic culture in the city. As far as organization goes, Kintargo is divided into 8 different districts, the oldest of which, of course, is Old Kintargo. This part of the city holds a lot of the city's industry, with fisheries and warehouses and stuff like that. But it's also got a number of residential neighborhoods with houses that are ranging from squalid all the way to large and almost fortified. Going north from there is the Castle District, which of course is dominated by Castle Kintargo, and that is the main fortification for the city. And then kind of almost stuck between the 2 of them a little bit is Jarvis End. And this is kind of the entertainment center of the city. This is where you find your music houses and theaters and art galleries, and it's got kind of the nightlife of the city. And it's in Jarvis End where you find the crown jewel of the city, and that is the Opera House. And the Opera House may not be as imposing as the 3 large buildings you saw on the skyline, but it is sort of the heart of the city. If you asked most residents of the city what one building defines Kintargo, they would probably say it's the Opera House. Right next to Jarvis End is Temple Hill, which is, of course, dominated by the Temple of Asmodeus, which used to be the temple to Eridan before Eridan died. But that's not the only building on the hill. There are a number of other temples and other buildings around the hill, and it is essentially the religious center of the city. And then next to that is Red Roof. Red Roof is sort of the middle and lower class section of the city. And it gets its name because the buildings in Red Roof are mostly made from red brick, as well as the roof tiles used on those buildings. And so the entire neighborhood has a different feel to it because of the construction materials used, because they are not as expensive as that silver-flecked limestone. Crossing the Bleak Bridge, you go into the Ulubilis Harbor district. And this is sort of the trade center for the city. It contains the city's main harbor. Of course, there's the older harbor in Old Kintargo, but as years went on and the city grew, that harbor wasn't nearly enough. And so the Ulubilis harbor was built, and it's a much larger harbor capable of handling much more trade. And then from there, you go to the Villegra district. And this is sort of the educational center of the city. And it is dominated by the tall spires of the Alabaster Academy. Although, since the Civil War, the Alabaster Academy and much of Villegra has not seen the same patronage that it did before the Civil War. The Alabaster Academy used to be known almost worldwide, and people would travel from all over the continent to attend the university, but now not so much. And the final district is the Greens, and this is an entire district occupied by just a small number of families, and this is where the wealthy people live. This is the good neighborhood. Politically, the city is currently led by the Lord Mayor Gilia Benilus, who is really a good representative of the city overall. Outwardly, she shows respect to the government and to the Thrones and to the Church of Asmodeus that are in power, but inwardly she's much more independent. In fact, the only time that the country's laws are really enforced is when the Chelish Navy comes to visit, which it does on occasion in its patrols around the country. Other than that, the city enjoys quite a bit of freedom. And so that concludes my nice brief introduction to the history of Golarion and of the Inner Sea region and of Cheliax and of Ravounel Forest and of the Silver City of Kintargo. Hopefully this was at least a little bit more informative than if I had just copied and pasted all the information from the books.